Yo, what's going on? This is OnDeck, and I recently had some viewers ask me how I mix and master my beats. So I took this beat from a canceled project, and I'm going to show you how we can get it from sounding like this to sounding like this. We're going to go through the whole process from the drums, the sample, the low end, all the way into Ableton for the final mix and master. Stay tuned and let's get right into it. I started this beat by making the drums, so we're going to start explaining the mix by looking at drums. It has a decent amount going on here. If you look into my effects here, most of them are quite raw. I got them the way I wanted them out of the box, but on some of the percussion sounds, I like to turn up the tube drive and really saturate them and high pass the low end. Like this ride cymbal, there shouldn't be any real low end stuff on it. Same with the hat, open hat, these perks, same idea going on. With the snare, maybe I cut out a little bit of that low end stuff. On the layer, I cut out a little more. This bit crushing you see going on, that's just to kind of lower the bit rate of it. Sometimes it makes it feel a little bit punchier. And with this kick, I use the low pass here because it's a little bit lighter. A little bit of this bass E, which it kind of like just boosts your low end so you don't have to add a low end layer. On this snare and its layer, I add short reverbs. And then this SP1200 plugin, just because it adds a little bit of crunch to the snare and makes it hit a little bit harder. The real magic of most of my drum processing happens when I go to the bus here, which is actually quite simple. I added some saturation from the air filter, just the regular overdrive mode, and then tried to gain match it at the bottom here, so I didn't just think it sounded better because it was louder. And then I rolled off some of the top end starting at about 9.5 kilohertz. Just adds a little bit more saturation. This soft clipper, I really love this plugin in the MPC. I don't really use too many of the paid plugins, but if you do buy one, I do recommend the soft clipper because I use it on my drums all the time, whether I'm in Ableton or on the MPC. You can kind of add gain into the soft clipper, get a little bit of reduction, and then lower the volume. It's a good alternative to just using one compressor because you don't really get too much of a tonal change, and you still get that glue as well as the punch from the drive. I'll show you what I mean. This versus when I turn it on. Now it's light, but it goes a long way. The last thing I added was an enhancer. I wanted to boost that 1.5-ish kilohertz crack on the snare and the low end. Sometimes I experiment with adding some harmonics so it sounds a little bit more natural. Once you add that on, it goes from this to this. Next, this is my chop program. So first things first, I did a little bit of stereo width because it needed to take a little bit more room in the mix. I chose this sample partially because I already knew I liked the low end of it. So I went into this beat knowing I'd cut the low end and then process it on its own track. Here we get into a little bit of EQ. On this track, I'm just lowering some of that 250. In that 500 range, there's a lot of weight. So if I play it, so it felt like I was just adding the weight back into those horns and those chords. Around the 700, I think maybe it was just a little too much, so I had to dial it back. Usually that's where a lot of like the air instruments or wind instruments, rather, they're gonna sit in that range here, so I'll show you. So just tuck that back slightly and then just bring up the overall brightness by changing this 6000 kilohertz, just boosting it a little bit with the shelf. Now the filter. You see here, this is where I'm cutting out the low end, starting at about 290. And I guess I add a little bit of reverb with a longer pre-delay to kind of push it back. I'll take these out. So it's subtle, but it does go a long way. And then lastly, this is a duplicate of the sample track. At the end here, I'm cutting it a little bit lower and adding some saturation. I think for this case, I just need a little bit more room in the low end. Usually I just cut it where I put the high pass filter on the sample track, but I think I ended up getting a little too muddy in that range, which is why I cut it lower here. But what I also did was add this amp simulation here, boosted a bit of the bass, and then took away a bit of that like 300 range in the mids, probably because of mud. EQ, my main approach here was just to low cut the really low stuff, like the rumbly 500 frequencies that might get in the way of the kick, and boost the 150th range, which might give it a little bit more tone. I'll play it and then I'll add them back in one by one. That is the whole mix in the MPC. But then we do a little bit of pre-master here, which sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't. I just added a little soft clipper here just to bring up the level a little bit more. And then some para EQ where I took out a bit of that 2K, add a little bit more thump to the kick, and added a little bit more brightness to the 12.1. And this is something I would usually do while I'm listening to it through the SP. I use a pretty light SP303 compression on here, like maybe with the knob turned to 25. Not as hard as I usually go on it, but just a little bit. I'll show you why once we get into Ableton, but for now, let's end the MPC portion of this by playing the beat. But now it's time to talk about how I processed it once I recorded it into Ableton. So here's the session where I made the original 2-track auto filter here. This is just used for an automation, like I do a filter sweep at the start of the song. But let's get into the more important things that shape the sound. Normally, I use a couple plugins on my UAD Apollo Twin and cook it into the recording. You can see I record usually through the SSL channel or a Neve preamp, just to give it some additional color and saturation. And then I have this one here. This is the ATR 102 tape machine. And you can get a lot of different results by even doing something as simple as just changing this knob here. And for additional compression, if I go light on compression, I'll usually add an SSL G bus. However, in this session, I did that in the DAW, and you'll be able to see the exact settings I used. So here, I actually kept it at 15. I think this is honestly the default. If you just throw on a default ATR 102, you will probably get a similar sound. Before we go on to the other plugins, let me just play the beat with just the tape machine so you can hear the subtle saturation that it adds to the overall sound. So yeah, super subtle, but honestly, it goes a long way. If you don't have the Ampex ATR 102 plugin, don't worry, there are some solid alternatives. A lot of people like to use the J37 by Waves. You could even try and use something like a vinyl distortion. If you see here in the drive and color, so you could try this vinyl distortion and probably get a solid sound from that. Okay, now that that's covered, let's get into the next plugin here. I'm using this plugin that I absolutely adore, the UAD Pultec EQP 1A. Again, if you're looking for alternatives, the Puig Tech in Waves, I think Arturia has one now. I'm sure Slate has one now. All these companies, they have different kinds of emulations of this. So if you don't have the exact UAD one, don't trip about it. You'll be able to get a very similar sound with something else. What I did here was I set this low frequency to 30. I both boosted and attenuated the same frequency, which seems weird, right? Because you would think that would just go up 3 and then down 3 and then be back at 0. But that's not really how the Pultec works. The attenuation, it kind of cuts the bell here. The boost kind of does like a shelf. So it kind of creates this like cut and boost thing where if you use it really low, you'll get right on your punchy, those chest frequencies, those low chest frequencies that get hit by the kick. You'll get those boosted, and then it'll cut out the lows. So it ends up giving you like a really nice tight low end. And then I boosted a few decibels at 16K, and again, attenuated at 20 to kind of get a similar effect of that brightness without too much of the really, really high end. Anyways, let me play it with and without so you can hear what that's doing. Yeah, you can see like that kick hits harder, but it all feels kind of more glued together. The whole 2-track has a similar EQ curve. Now next, we're going to go into the SSL-G bus compressor. Now I told you I'd normally record with these in, but I like having them in the DAW for this case just so I could show you. If you don't have the SSL-G bus compressor or even the Waves version of the SSL compressor, you could always use something like the glue compressor in Ableton. It's also amazing. And it's kind of modeled after the same controls of the SSL, so it'll give you a very similar sound. This is just very light compression that I have on this track here. The attack is at 10 milliseconds, pretty standard for like an instrumental bus or even a master, because it's not going to clamp too hard on the drums, still going to let the transients through. It's just at a ratio of 2, so it's not compressing too hard, and the release is set to auto. Let's see what happens when I turn it on and turn it off. Yeah, so we're just talking about, a couple decibels of reduction, nothing too crazy. I did light compression or light soft clipping in the MPC, then light compression in the SP. So I just used several different light compressors. So none of them are doing too much work, but they're all just doing a little bit. They're all just helping each other out. After that, I was pretty satisfied. So I started thinking more about the master and how I would get this to the proper level. On my master bus, I kept it pretty simple. Just one EQ, one ozone with a dynamic EQ and a limiter, and then one final limiter. I already used a lot of my color tools on the 2-track of the beat, so I don't really have to worry about doing too much of mastering. Anyways, with this Pro Q3, I just took out a little bit of these mids by just scooping and just seeing kind of what was peaking too much and then bringing it down a little bit. I'll show you what that looks like in practice. Yeah, so they're just some resonant peaks in the mids that I wasn't a big fan of, so I just took those out. And then I think I had a little bit too much in the high end here with the snare and the hat, so I just took that down slightly. Next, ozone. I'm not doing that much with this. The main thing I'm doing here is dynamic EQ. Basically what it's doing is taking any peaks that are popping out and it's just bringing them down really quickly with dynamic EQ. And the reason is, I want to get the limiter to not react to every little thing that pops out. The more smooth it is and dynamically controlled, the easier it will be for me to limit it. But at the same time, I don't want to just squash it with the compressor to fix that problem. All right, now the last thing on this chain is the maximizer. This one is not set all the way. I had a little bit of transient emphasis here. I lowered oh my God, I lowered the threshold just enough so I'm catching those peaks. The ceiling's at 1.5, minus 1.5 decibels. So I have room to use my final limiter to bring it up to the volume I want. But basically, I'll play it here really quickly. If you were paying attention to this limiter here, you notice it's only taking at max half a decibel off. So it's just clipping the top of those peaks slightly. And I did that so that when I went into this limiter here, the Pro L2, I could just do a slight boost and get the levels I want. So after I was done with this maximizer, it was time for the final limiter here. This is where you can bring up your overall volume and make sure it's loud enough. And you can also use something like a loudness meter. This is a free one from a company called Ulean, and it's pretty good. It just tells you, your LUFS ratings. It's a way to measure overall loudness, and you can just see if you have it loud enough. Now, there's different use cases for the metering, but for this, I knew that I was going to throw it into a different session and then use it again. So before this video, all I really did was have this a couple decibels up. So it was just clipping the peaks again. But if we're doing this for real, like we're going to release this beat standalone, we might do something like this. Usually I aim for this number to be like -10, maybe -9 if I want it to be a little bit louder. Usually you'd look at the integrated value. So you'd play the whole song and then get a reading for the whole thing. This short term, it's reading it all the time and it's constantly changing, but this is like your overall. And then you have a loudness range, like the quietest part and the loudest part. What's the difference between those? But it's going to stay a pretty consistent volume. So let's just throw this master on, get a basic readout, check out what it sounds like with the limiter. Alright, so that's what it sounds like after all the processing. I hope you got something out of this video. If not, I hope you enjoyed watching my personal process. And yeah, stay tuned for more videos coming soon. Thank you guys so much for watching. Peace.